So, what is sunlight? It sounds like a strange question because sunlight is surely just the light that comes from the sun. And that's true on a very, very simplistic level. But there's not just one type of light that comes from the sun. We can't actually, as humans, see most of the light that comes from the sun. And actually, the different types of light that come from the sun have different impacts on our health, mental health, physical health. And I want to first of all lay the foundations in this video by talking about these different types of light that come from the sun. Now, the first thing I wanted to point out is that the light that we receive from the earth comes from different parts of the sun itself. So, first of all, the visible light that we see comes from what's known as the photosphere. The photosphere is the surface of the sun. And so the light that humans can see comes from the photosphere. Then you've got the light that comes from a layer that is above the photosphere, which is called the chromosphere. The chromosphere is where we get what's known as infrared light, infrared radiation. So I'm going to talk about that in a second. And most of the light that we get on Earth, by the way, comes in the form of infrared radiation. So most of the light that we actually get on the Earth that we as humans can't see comes from the chromosphere. Then you've got the light that comes from another part of the sun, which is the halo of the sun, or the outer kind of haze of the sun. So, sometimes you'll see a solar eclipse and you'll see the moon covering up the most of the sun, but there'll be like a kind of halo around the moon from the sun behind it. That is the corona, or the crown. And the crown is where we get ultraviolet radiation from. So it's already, we're seeing that there are different parts of the sun give different types of light that make it down to the surface of the earth. Now, as far as light itself goes, it's important to understand that light is basically an energy form that spreads in the form of radiation rather than going through rather than physically. And that radiation is emitted in the form of waves. So each ray of light, if you want to call it that, I'm not sure if that's actually the scientifically proper way of calling it, but just for purposes of simplicity, each ray of light is in the form of an electromagnetic wave. And it's called an electromagnetic wave because it has both electrical and magnetic qualities. And you'll see this image is a very good image from the University of Waikato, which shows you very simply the different types of light that exist that come from the sun specifically. And you'll see there that they differ, don't they? Some of them are very, very squiggly, very tightly packed together waves, like gamma rays here on the side here. That is the strongest form of solar radiation that comes from the sun. Then you've got X-ray, which again is very strong, but not quite as strong as gamma rays. Then you've got ultraviolet radiation, again, very high energy radiation, but not, it's getting, as we're moving over here toward the left. And again, this is just human, diagrams trying to understand something that you can't really encapsulate all of these things in the form of just a simple 2D diagram, but it's useful for the purpose of kind of getting the basics. As the waves of the radiation, the energy get longer and longer, bigger, less tight, then the energy goes down. So visible light is lower energy than ultraviolet light. Then you've got infrared radiation, lower energy, longer wavelength than visible light. Then you've got microwaves, again, longer wavelengths. And then you've got finally radio waves, which are the longest wavelength, but the lowest energy. So these are all the different forms of radiation energy that come from the sun. And it's important to say that radiation, if you're like me, I grew up thinking that radiation was just something terrible that came from nuclear power plants or from nuclear bombs, and you had to get away from it. But radiation is just a description of a type of energy that is propagated in a certain way, specifically light. So the energy that we get from the sun, and remember, the sun forms the large majority of all the energy that we have on Earth comes from the sun. That energy comes to us not physically, but it comes in the form of light, which is energy that is radiated to us. Now, this image here is useful to point out that not all of the forms of radiation, and not all of the forms of energy that come from the sun reach the Earth's surface. And you'll see here that all of the visible light does reach the Earth's surface. Some of the ultraviolet light reaches the Earth's surface. Some of the infrared reaches the Earth's surface, and some of the radio waves do. But the rest of them are blocked by the Earth's atmosphere, unless you go really, really high up in the sky. So gamma rays, none of those come through the surface. X-rays, none of those come through the surface. Ultraviolet, most of those are blocked by the Earth's atmosphere, and most of the infrared. And this is important because if these gamma rays, X-rays, and ultraviolet, most of the ultraviolet rays came and hit the Earth surface, we would all surely die because they are just such strong, powerful forms of energy. They're just too intense. We would not be able to cope. We don't have the equipment as human beings to be able to withstand that. These high powered energy waves hitting us. So we have adapted, or we've been designed to make use of the energies that do make their way down into the Earth, and that's this optical range. We call it the visible range. Again, some of the ultraviolet comes down here, and of course, you'll know from ultraviolet from conversations around things like vitamin D, things like skin cancer, melanoma, stuff like that, aging, and all that sort of stuff. That you're talking about ultraviolet radiation here. And then you've got infrared as well. And infrared doesn't usually get talked much about in regards to health, but infrared, as I'm going to show in future videos, is extremely, extremely important, critical for our health as human beings. But this just shows you that not all the energy that comes from the sun makes its way down to the Earth's surface. And we will come back to this as well in a future presentation. Just to talk a little bit about the variations that you have in solar radiation. So this map on the left shows that, unsurprisingly, Africa gets the most amount of sunlight in a year, followed by, I believe, Australia out of the habited continents. Antarctica, I think, gets more sunlight, but nobody lives there, so it's not that important right now. And then even within the continent of Africa itself, you see there is variation in the amount of solar radiation. Some parts are very, very dark, which means the highest amount of solar radiation, solar energy, and some parts are not so much. And this is where Homo sapiens sapiens, as we know, emerged from the East Africa region, and it makes sense that this is the most sun-kissed part of the Earth, because it should tell you something about human health and well-being. We must be calibrated to sunlight because sunlight is the biggest form of energy on the Earth, and we originate, particularly us Africans, originate from the continent of Africa, which is the most sun-kissed continent in the globe. This image here just points out that solar radiation also fluctuates through seasonally, and through the day. So through the day, the amount of radiation reaching us is higher in the middle of the day than it is in the morning or evening. And also, you'll see that there's a lot more solar radiation in the summer than there is in the winter. Self-explanatory. I wanted to just point out that when we look at something and we see that it is a particular color, what we're really seeing is that entity is reflecting some of the visible light that it's receiving. So in the case of an apple here, you'll see that it absorbs all of the visible spectrum from the sun apart from the red. It might absorb some of it, but it reflects a large chunk of it, which is why this particular apple is red. If the apple was green, then it would just be green that's being reflected, red being absorbed. And it's quite fascinating because I'd love to know whether the type of light that's being absorbed has an impact has biochemical impacts on the actual organism itself. I'm pretty sure it does. Of course, with leaves, we know that chlorophyll reflects green light, but all the other forms of light are absorbed by green plants. And then another way of putting it is this: that if we perceive something as humans, if we perceive it as being red, that's because the red is being reflected. If we perceive something as being white, that's because pretty much all of the visible spectrum is being reflected back at us, which makes it white. And if we perceive something as being black, all of the visible spectrum is being absorbed by that thing. So Hence, those of us who have high amounts of eumelanin, good melanin in our bodies, in our skin and hair, eyes, and so forth, we appear as darker skinned because our eumelanin rich skin is absorbing the vast majority of the visible light that is being shone on it. And I bring that point up. That's important to know. Light comes from what is being what we perceive as red or black or whatever is a function of what the substance or object is absorbing or reflecting. And that's important because when you look at the solar spectrum, this is all of the light that reaches the Earth from the sun. We've got rid of gamma rays, X rays, and so forth, and these are this is the majority of the light that actually comes to Earth isn't visible light. Visible light makes about 42 to 43% of the light overall that comes to the planet, the surface of the Earth, and it is the strongest intensity of light is in the visible spectrum, part of the spectrum. However, the majority overall, if you count it all up, count up all of the watts or whatever, however they do it, the majority of the solar energy that comes to us is in the form of infrared light. And again, we can't see infrared light as human beings. Some animals we think can. I think snakes might be able to see infrared, but we cannot see infrared. And then you've got 3 to 5% is ultraviolet, which might be surprising. You might think that ultraviolet would make up a bigger chunk of solar radiation because it gets talked about so much. But it's only 3 to 5%. But it shows how strong, how powerful those photons are, that they can cause so much positive and negative impacts, even though they only make up a very, very small proportion. Now, going back to infrared, this is important. More than half of the light that we receive on Earth is invisible to humans. And because of that, we tend to ignore the importance of infrared because we can't see it. There's a thing that's called infrared technology, which is a very, very interesting thing to finish up with. Infrared photography, rather. What they do, they can set up cameras so that they will pick up infrared light. And then what they do, because we don't know what infrared light looks like, we can't perceive it with our eyes, they tell these cameras or devices to render the infrared signal that it's picking up, render it in an image as white or red or whatever color. Usually it's white. And you'll see here, this shows us something very interesting. If this is a normal photograph, this would all be green here. This would be green grass, green leaves, green trees there, bushes and so forth and so on. But they're rendered as white. The reason it's showing as white here is because green trees, grass, bushes and so forth reflect loads and loads of the infrared radiation that they receive. So most of the infrared radiation that plants, are exposed to gets rebound to us. And that's important because it means that when we're walking out and about in nature, not only are we getting, large chunks of infrared light from the direct sunlight that's shining down on us, also the trees and the plants and the grass and the bushes are reflecting humongous amounts of infrared light to us as well, just by reflection. But again, we can't see it because our eyes can't perceive it. But it's really important to understand that when we are taking walks out in nature, even just in a park or whatever, we are being bathed in infrared light from the sun directly, but also in large part from reflection, the reflected infrared light from the trees and bushes. In this image here, they've tweaked it so that the infrared is shown as reddy, whitey red. And again, most of the light that's being most of the radiation, infrared radiation that grass and plants and trees are receiving is being reflected back. And that's going to be really important in future presentations that I'm going to do with regard to the impact of sunlight in particular on our health and well-being. So I hope that's been useful in giving an overview of what sunlight actually is. And I will see you in the next presentation. Take care. Peace out.